The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television. This program on Pioneer Public Television is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4, 2008. Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yekel-Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org. The Arrowwood Resort and Conference Center, your ideal choice for Minnesota resorts offering luxury townhomes, 18 holes of golf, Darling Reflection Spa, Big Splash Water Park, and much more. Alexandria, Minnesota, a relaxing vacation or great location for an event. Explore alex.com. Easy to get to, hard to leave.
Welcome to Postcards, our weekly look at the arts, history, and cultural heritage of Western Minnesota and beyond. I'm your host, Dana Johnson. This week we'll learn about steam engines with local engineers from Willmar and ride the rails with Twin Cities and Western Railroad. First, Tom Steinman, Elman Ekblad, and Bob Feidinger share with us their legendary tales from the track.
Railroad had a certain romantic fascination, I think, with a lot of kids.
Well, it's probably an odd term to use, but I think most railroad men would agree that there was a certain romance with the steam engine. You got to love them.
It was the idea that you were on the move. There was something about a steam engine that when you got it going, if you worked it right, it couldn't have sounded like a sewing machine. When you get in a diesel, it's just like getting a truck and going. There's no momentum there that there is when you have a steam engine.
Diesel was much more comfortable, of course, but there was something romantic about a steam engine.
Not only the thrill of that either, but the thrill of the people off the track, children, they just loved the steam engines. They'd come out along the track, a lot of places where we see new kids would be. We'd always have candy. There was always a lot of entertainment.
My interest in working on a railroad, I guess I would have to say it was a moment in Fulda, Minnesota, when a locomotive engineer looked out of his cab down at me as a little 5-year-old and tossed a pack of blackjack gum down there. And when I saw that, I told myself I would really like to be an engineer driving locomotives. And that stuck with me for my entire life. And so in a way I sort of was living a life of something that started when I was just a young boy.
Well, I started right after I got out of the military up in St. Cloud. And then I came to visit a friend in Willmar, and he talked me into hiring out here on the engine service.
Then he asked me if I wanted to go railroading, and I said, yeah. Well, he says, how old are you? I says, I'm 16. Oh, he says, you got to be 21. Well, the next year, then him and the boss down at the roundhouse, they come back to me again and asked me if I wanted to go railroad, and I says, yeah, but age. He said, we've taken care of that. I found out later that they'd filled out a birth certificate. In place of me being born in 1918, they showed 1915. So I went to work I was only 17 years old in place of 21.
Actually, my first job on the train itself was a fireman. And the fireman was the assistant to the locomotive engineer. I guess you could call it an apprenticeship. And you had to get the steam engine out of the roundhouse in the morning, get it ready for the engineer and the conductor and the crew to get on. And then when the day's work was done, it was your job to take the steam engine to the roundhouse and, as we would call it, put it to bed for the night. And after going out and about in the world, 1977, I came back to the railroad and I made a career of it. And I just recently retired after 34 years on the railroad.
There were many interesting things. 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning as the sun come up, you'd be going across the countryside. You'd see animals. Probably some farmer didn't know he had fox in his backyard. The sun coming up and the crops waving in the wind. It was very picturesque to see. Every trip was different. Every trip was different. Something unusual or different would happen. It was, you never knew what to expect.
Craziest thing I've ever seen is we come into Charlesville, Minnesota. That's between here and Breckenridge. And we seen some cattle on the track. And we figured, well, that's kind of usual, you know. But we got a little closer, then I could see it was a red bull. And this red bull, he kind of stood and looked at us. And then when we got, I'd say, about 100 yards from it, he started putting his head down, you know, and he got a little closer. He started using his hoof and he was going to show us who was boss. Well, we hit him and we just pulverized him. And then the good thing, we had a new brakeman, and he had never worked on a trip before. And the first thing he did, he put his head out the window and wanted to see what happened. Well, the good thing I grabbed him and pulled him back in, because one of the legs of the bull went right by and broke the window, and he maybe would have got killed. So that was pretty unusual. That's one thing I never did forget.
With the Barnum and Bailey circus trains, when the train would actually park at Midway over in the Twin Cities, it was quite an event. The animals in their cages would be wagons, wooden-wheeled wagons, and the elephants would head down the main streets of St. Paul or Minneapolis, headed to their big circus tent or the state fairgrounds from the railroad siding where they would park the train. Is everybody wanted to come and see the circus heading down the street from the railroad yard off to the tent.
Willmar is one of the best smaller railroad towns in Minnesota, and it's been noted for that. It's kind of a headquarters, because the trains went to St. Cloud and they went to Sioux City, and we had locals going out of here. They went to Watertown, so it was kind of a hub. And people always, but even people that lived in West Coast, they always talked about the Willmar.
I can't imagine a town like Willmar without a railroad. This railroad that runs through Willmar, the railroads that run through other towns in western Minnesota, are the through points of a lot of products that are passing through from the west coast of the United States to Chicago and the east coast, and vice versa.
And I like to be busy, and I like to have a challenge. And the biggest challenge we had on the railroad was the weather. We had to put up with all kinds of weather, snowstorms, and we went out and plowed snow, you know, or left Willmar, and the snow banks were 4 or 5 feet high. But if we could get a pretty good speed on, we could go quite a ways through a drift.
1997 was memorable in Willmar for being a winter of ferocious blizzards. And in particular, I remember one memorable night going to Clara City that we not only went into the snowbank, but we went through the snowbank and came out the other end. And the train was covered in snow by the time we came out the other end. I guess the fondest memories come from the camaraderie of the other fellow employees I work with, and talking about the good trips we had, and of course grumbling about the bad trips we had.
You miss the men, and that's why to this day I have coffee with Elman and some other railroad men. You You miss the camaraderie.
I never had any trouble with the men working with you on the railroad. They were very cooperative. Out in a snowstorm, they tried to get signals to me so I could see them when we didn't have radios. But they did, between the brakemen and myself, it seemed like there wasn't a situation that we couldn't get through some way.
If I would have to tell anyone one particular thing that has had a lasting memory for me as an employee of the railroad was the predictability that I was going to have a job tomorrow. I was very fortunate that I was able to spend my entire career with one employer. Most of the towns across America are here because the railroad came through that part of the state. In southern Minnesota, and particularly in Willmar, Willmar was a major stopping off point for trains. There's a lot of grain shipped out of Willmar, a lot of ethanol, and a lot of lumber and fertilizer that travels through Willmar on its destinations, either near Chicago or south to Iowa. A lot of these cars and the entire train, which is called a unit train, will stay in one piece all the way to its final destination. And if it's grain, most commonly it goes all the way to Seattle or Long Beach, California. Other trains go to the Mississippi River to be unloaded on barges. It's a diesel-electric locomotive, and they're extremely efficient. They're so much more efficient than trucks hauling products across the country that a lot of trucks now are hauled on railroad flat cars rather than a tractor-trailer rig going across the country on the interstate highway system. In 1920, as I recall, I think 2 million people worked on the railroad. And in 2010, it was 200,000 people. So that's 1/10 the number of people. But the railroads are hauling more than they ever have. There's an efficiency there that was missing for many, many years until the 1980s. Trains are bigger, they're longer, they're faster, and there's fewer people that are on the trains and repairing the track.
The reason why I think this one is special because this was the first steam engine they had that pulled the Empire Builder through the mountains. This was it wasn't big, it's small according to today, but it was big enough, and it was the first one that was won the Empire Builder. The superintendent, he said we could have it, so we built the track from the yard out here at a curve and hooked and right where it stands right now. This historical society would not be what it is today if we hadn't gotten that locomotive moved out here, because that people go by and they see that locomotive, they've never been in Willmar, and they'll still stop in.
When I was a young boy, the passenger trains did operate. My hometown, Chandler, Minnesota, I can remember it just like it was yesterday. My mother would take me down to the train station, and I would get on the train, and actually it was a steam engine powered train, and I would go to Iona, Minnesota to stay with my grandparents, and it was 14 miles and it cost 7 cents. And my mother would pin a little note on my pocket, and the note would say to the conductor, "Please make sure Tommy gets off at Iona." And then she would give me 10 cents for the ride back. Well, those days are long gone.
To find out more about these stories and other local history, visit the Kandiyohi County Museum in Willmar, Minnesota. Now let's hop on board with Twin Cities and Western Railroad and learn about its impact on local communities.
I love it all because you learn something new every day. Everything's different. Every day is a different day, you know. And you work with different people all the time, and it's just fun.
Oh yeah, when I was in like a little kid, I always wanted to be a railroad engineer, and then I end up working on the section here. Didn't fall far from the tree, I guess.
It's pretty much different every day, but this is what we're doing now is one of the more routine jobs that we do.
Twin Cities and Western Railroad has been a major part of transporting goods across Minnesota. President Mark Wagner provides rail service across southwestern Minnesota into the Twin Cities.
Good. Well, the history is it was originally built by the Hastings and Dakota back in the 1870s. The Hastings and Dakota became part of the Milwaukee Road. The Milwaukee Road built the Pacific Extension in 1909. So this line here was part of a main line from Chicago to Tacoma, Washington. At one point posted 80-mile-an-hour passenger trains. The rail industry started to decline in the after World War II, a gradual decline which accelerated during the 1960s and 70s. And by 1980, the Milwaukee Road declared bankruptcy. They abandoned from Montana to the west coast. The Montana to the Minnesota border was acquired by the state of South Dakota, and the Milwaukee retained from Ortonville into the Twin Cities and, as part of their system. They were sold in 1985 to the Sioux Line, and in 1991 the Sioux Line sold the segment from the Twin Cities out to Appleton to the Twin Cities and Western, and hence we were formed July 26, 1991. We serve south central Minnesota. Basically our draw area is maybe 30 miles either side of the main line. We go through Glencoe, Olivia, Montevideo out to Appleton, along 212 primarily. We are like a spoke in a great big hub. We connect in St. Paul to the Canadian Pacific, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the Union Pacific, which serve the North American continent. So we're basically giving our customers a gateway to the world.
Today we'll be spotting empty grain cars for these elevators, and we'll go out to the rural sugar beet plant and give them empties for their sugar. And today we got some coke on there and coal and empty sugar cars, and then we go out to Granite Falls ethanol plant. We service that daily, and that's about it.
The unique thing about the Twin Cities and Western is we do connect with 3 major railroads in the Twin Cities, so our customers have competition to go on the North American continent, which isn't always true of other railroads. They're captive to one single railroad. I think the railroad will be important because the steel-on-steel technology, steel wheels on steel rails, is very low resistance. Hence, we achieve some great fuel economies for the tonnage we move. Moving 1 ton of freight 435 miles on 1 gallon of fuel is often quoted. We're roughly anywhere between 4 times to 10 times more fuel efficient than trucks, depending on whose study you look at. But I think the nation didn't realize how important the railroads were up until about 2003, when gas started to go up and diesel hit $5 a gallon. Then all of a sudden everybody wanted to ship rail. So if you think there's an unlimited supply of oil in the world, yeah, we'll go away, but I don't think that's the case.
Twin Cities and Western Railroad also owns the Minnesota Prairie Line. Julie Rath talks about the efforts of the Minnesota Valley Regional Railroad Authority and their efforts to restore the tracks.
And I'm sure it was founded on the basis to provide services for the ag community. We have an elevator right behind us, and I don't know the year of that, but it says number 2 on it. So it's got quite a history, and it's a vibrant corridor for the communities that are along here. There are 16 communities in the 5 counties that are dependent on this rail service, and the actual railroad itself was revitalized again in 2002. It had various owners and actually went inactive for 2 years, and then the 5 counties took the ownership back and formed the Minnesota Valley Regional Rail Authority. You know, our rail line starts at Norwood Young American, goes all the way to Hanley Falls. It's 94 miles of track, and we're currently doing a rail restoration or rehab project. And so we've done 24 miles so far, and so we're getting there inch by inch. We always say, I think I can, and we will get that done. Well, we have a big vision in that area. We have a group in the Redwood area that's called Tonka Bluffs, and our goal is to use the rail for vintage passenger rail service. To bring people out from the Hopkins Depot for the weekend, bring your bike with and explore the southern part of Minnesota for biking, camping, horseback riding, to see where Minnesota history really happened. And we think that's key because a lot of the historic sites that you learn about in your 6th grade history are really here, and we want to share that with students especially. There's a big plan for the future, and it's all dependent on this rail line. I mean, it's pretty unique. Aside from Amtrak, you just don't hop on a train. So if we can get this vintage rail service put together, that was a very good attraction for some of the people that are forming the History Learning Center concept, just because it's a unique experience. It's more authentic travel, as you could say, and it takes the past and brings it into the future. We're seeing increased traffic as we do the rehab. This past year we had just under 7,000 carloads that were shipped on our line. Our funding that we're receiving either through the state of Minnesota or federal government is a huge investment in this type of transportation corridor, which is key to the area. And for us to have that kind of investment, we need to make sure that we can leverage those dollars for future development, whether it's new manufacturers that come out here. I see this as a renewable energy corridor because of the amount of biomass that we have in our 5-county area. And so personally, right now we're working on several renewable fuel projects that are dependent on this rail getting restored. And what we're doing is replacing rail that's from 1880, 1912, which is 80 or 85 pound rail with a 115 pound rail. The new train cars are 286,000 pounds, and so we need a heavier rail for them to run on for safety.
Well, I guess I'm kind of a historian by nature, and realizing that railroads were the cause of many town formations in the Minnesota particularly, yeah, I did follow the rail industry, and if you look at some of the towns where the rail has disappeared, you know, the towns are kind of disappearing as well. So here, fortunately, we're able to run a good railroad, which in turn injects vibrancy into the communities we serve. So, and we continue to do that.
Well, it's allowed the elevator in town here to expand, which increases the employment base, which brings more families to the communities, which increases the schools and grocery stores, the retail trade, everything is improved because of the rail.
The builders of the railroad tended to plat towns anywhere between 7 to 10 miles apart, basically a day trip with a horse and buggy to bring the grain into town. So that's kind of how the towns are platted. We see ourselves as renewing the town's economic bases. We have relationships with the economic development agencies, things like that. If we grow jobs in south central Minnesota and grow the communities we serve, then we've done our job.
In 2008, Twin Cities and Western was named the Short Line Railroad of the Year. With its ability to reach the corners of the country, it's no wonder people enjoy being part of this rail service.
I don't know, it's something that not everybody gets to do. You know, you can tell people stories about this stuff that they don't know anything about, so they're kind of interested in hearing what you have to say.
I believe that we will have additional expansion happen in the future. Winthrop is an excellent example, about 20 miles to the east of us, that has had, because the rail's getting closer to that, the community can actually see, feel, and touch the improvements and are planning for the future. They've added a new fertilizer facility. They've had a new Winfield Ag Solutions moved to the community, combining into a larger distribution center. The ethanol plant expanded with the hope that the rail would expand, and UFC's congregated there, so they've got great things going on. Dairy Farmers of America is doing an expansion, and they're all dependent on transporting their goods by rail.
Local author Brent Olson shares his memories of traveling by train.
I like railroads. It's funny, but even though my hometown of Clinton hasn't even had a railroad for 20 years or more, railroads have a large place in my memory. An early memory is dropping my sister off at the station in Willmar for a trip to the West Coast to stay with cousins. I can still picture her walking across the tracks carrying a small suitcase and a large guitar. It wasn't long after that that I had my first experience on a train. I was about 12, and I was supposed to catch the train from Minneapolis to Morris after a stay at a church camp. It was my first time traveling alone, and I bet it really showed. A chubby blonde preteen clutching his ticket and sitting on the edge of his seat must have looked like a tempting target to the bum who kept coming over to me and telling me that if I came out behind the station, he would sell me something really good, really cheap. Now, I was dumb, but maybe not quite that dumb. I tried to ignore him, and when I saw a gaggle of nuns come in and sit in a swirl of black and white, I went and sat with them. That experience didn't turn me into a Catholic, but it did lead me to my fondness for nuns. Despite that, I do still love trains. Possibly because when my wife and I were married, we took every cent we had in the world and spent it on 6 weeks in Europe. A lot of that time was spent on trains, playing an endless game of gin rummy and occasionally glancing out the window at the passing scenery. The rocking of the cars, the chance meetings with interesting people, odd foods at train stations in odd countries, along with the constant company of a beautiful young woman, made the trip something that remains green in my memory. I'm a lot older now and contemplating another train trip. The odd food isn't nearly as big a temptation, but not having to drive in strange traffic is a big incentive. I do still have the same traveling companion. Some things, like trains, go on forever, or close enough.
That's all for this week. For more information, go to our website at pioneer.org/postcards. Join us again next week on Postcards.
This program on Pioneer Public Television is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4, 2008. Additional support provided by Mark and Margaret Yekel-Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. ShalomHillFarm.org. The Arrowwood Resort and Conference Center, your ideal choice for Minnesota resorts offering luxury townhomes, 18 holes of golf, Darling Reflection Spa, Big Splash Water Park, and much more. Alexandria, Minnesota, a relaxing vacation or great location for an event. Explore alex.com. Easy to get to, hard to leave.